Hello and welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be exploring the flagship customs from Gibson and PRS. Now, I'm not usually one of those creators that does those which one of these is better comparison videos, because without wishing to state the obvious, guitar preferences are entirely subjective, and often gear can't be compared like for like. So rather than this being a shootout video between my Les Paul Custom and my PRS Custom 24, I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison video that compares the two in terms of tone, feel, construction, and overall playability. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is physical feel, and I'm not going to run through the construction specifications of each of these guitars because there are plenty of other videos that do that better than me, but I want to talk about how these physically feel to me in my hands and when I'm playing them. The first thing that's quite obvious to pick up and point out is weight. Now, Les Paul Customs are known for being heavy guitars, and actually my Custom doesn't feel overly heavy. It actually feels comfortably weighty, if that's the thing. But I will say it's heavier. The neck is slightly thicker, or rounder, shall I say. I do have the pattern thin neck on my Custom 24. The body is less contoured, so it feels a bit more angular, especially round the binding. But I guess the big thing from a playability perspective is actually where the guitar naturally sits on your body, and importantly, where your left hand sits. What I mean by that is the Custom 24 being a 24 fret guitar, it feels a bit more like an SG. It feels like the neck goes out longer. But what that does mean is that higher up in the register, it's slightly closer to you and slightly more comfortable, and your access is better with the Custom 24 because you've got the dual cutaways. Whereas the Les Paul, if you have it square on your body sitting down like this, your arm doesn't feel like it goes out as far to get down towards the nut. Now, the other thing to pick out on physical feel is the scale length. The PRS has a slightly longer scale length, and what that means is that the strings always feel like they've got a little bit more tension on them. Now, when you're used to that, it's not really an issue or a problem in any way, but when you first pick up a PRS, it's definitely something you feel if you're used to playing a Gibson. Now, that extra tension in the strings, I believe, makes a big difference to the tonal characteristics of these two guitars. The PRS has a level of sustain and a level of clarity that I do believe the scale length contributes to. Now, no one's ever going to accuse a good Les Paul of not having sustain, but there is a resonance that you can feel through the body on the PRS, or at least I can on my Custom 24, which can be indirectly attributed to that scale length. Other things to point out physically in terms of feel between my two guitars is that my PRS is a satin nitro finish, so when you're running up and down the neck or you're just feeling in and around the body, it's a lot smoother to feel. And I guess this comes down to personal preference in terms of what you prefer in a finish between two guitars. Now, the other thing in terms of physical features is kind of hardware, and I guess this goes back to specification, where the PRS has a single volume, single tone, and a 5-way switch. The Les Paul has 2 volumes, 2 tones, and a 3-way selector. And that does mean actually the Les Paul technically has more tonal variations between those 3 pickups, because you can set different tone and volume levels between the two. And when you're in the middle position, again, you can infinitely tweak different volumes and different tones. And my Les Paul has the added feature of a coil tap as well. Now, the last thing I want to touch on in terms of features and specification is the bridge. Now, the Les Paul comes with the stop tail hard piece bridge, which is synonymous with all Gibsons, but the Custom 24 comes with PRS's own trem system. And I'm not just saying this because I'm some sort of PRS fanboy, but I really do genuinely believe this is the best trem system I've ever played. Now, I'm not Jeff Beck, I'm not using the trem system all of the time, but I like the feeling of having it there in case I do want to use it. It's incredibly smooth to use, and you don't actually compromise at all on stability when you're using it quite heavily. The guitar stays perfectly in tune, and you don't get the issue you get with other kind of floating trem systems when you hit the strings really hard and you get that wobble in the sound. But I guess the real question is, physically, in terms of feel, could you go from a Les Paul to a PRS Custom 24 and vice versa and it feel comfortable? The answer's kinda yes. I feel like if you're used to playing a Les Paul, if you're used to playing a Gibson style guitar, you might be more comfortable going to other Gibsons or even something like a Telecaster than maybe you would a Custom 24. I think if you're used to playing a Custom 24, there's maybe more similarities with a Strat, or like I said earlier, even something like an SG if you're used to playing something like this. Now, the next big thing I want to touch on is tone. And again, I don't want to say one is better than the other and vice versa. And I think it's worth pointing out that there's going to be variations in tone between different Les Pauls and different PRSs. I ended up buying these two guitars after comparing them to other Les Pauls and other Custom 24s. And the big thing that convinced me on these was the actual tone. But I guess if you're comparing the two, there's a few tonal characteristics that I would really point out as being the obvious differences. The Custom 24 has more of an upper mid-range to it. It's less beefy and weighty in the low end, or shall I say it's tighter in the low end. So where that really rings true or where that's really usable is in a mixed scenario, whether you're playing in a live band or you're recording with it. What you're going to get from this is a tighter guitar that's going to cut through a mix a lot better. But that signature mid-range isn't always to everyone's taste. It also requires you to be a bit more accurate with your playing. It's less forgiving. Those upper mid-ranges that I think this is tuned to is designed to accentuate everything you play. Les Paul, on the other hand, is pretty quintessential. I think a lot of us are familiar with what a Les Paul sounds like. I think it's worth pointing out maybe where I think customs are slightly different to standards. Maybe customs have a slightly tamed low end and slightly less sparkle in the high end that you might expect from a very vintage sounding Les Paul with PAF style pickups. This does actually have Monty's pickups in it that are more vintage PAF style pickups. And what I like about this is actually it's got the looks of a custom, the feel of a custom, but it's got sounds more like a vintage Les Paul. What this will add to a mix is that real weightiness. And actually when you're double tracking guitars or you just want that thicker, creamier sound, that's where the Les Paul comes in. But I will say, despite all of the versatility in this guitar in terms of the pickups, the switching, the coil tapping, it's perhaps not as versatile, I think, in all different scenarios to a Custom 24. Now that might be controversial to some because Les Pauls are synonymous with being played across tons of styles of music. But I just feel with the Custom 24, there's more usable applications to the tones that you have at your disposal. The Les Paul, I would never accuse of being a one-trick pony, but it's one of those guitars where in certain circumstances, only a Les Paul will do. And actually, to its credit, a Custom 24 just doesn't quite cut the mustard when you want that classic Les Paul sound. The last thing I want to talk about is almost entirely unquantifiable and totally personal. That's kind of the emotive connection with these two different guitars. Now, obviously we all as individuals have different emotional connections to our different guitars, but what does it feel like to play a Les Paul, a Gibson Les Paul Custom versus a PRS Custom 24? For me, I would be lying if I said I didn't feel differently playing these two guitars and they didn't bring out different styles of playing within me. When you're stood there on stage with a Gibson Les Paul Custom, you do feel like a bit of a rock god. You feel like, I don't know, Randy Rhoads / Zakk Wylde. It kind of encourages me to play a bit more classic rock, play with a bit more aggression, play with a bit more attack. The Custom 24, on the other hand, because I've owned it for longer and I'm arguably a bit more comfortable playing it, fits me a bit more like a glove, so I'm able to delve into different playing styles. I'm able to really focus more on playing accurately and playing articulately. The point is, the feeling of playing a Les Paul makes you play a little differently, and the feeling of playing a Custom 24 makes you play differently. There is a romanticism to playing a classic style Gibson guitar, whereas with a PRS, you don't have that same romanticism, but you do have a sense of this is peak quality instrument, and your playing kind of needs to match that. Now, how would I summarize this video between these two customs? I know I haven't really spoken about the Les Paul specifically as a custom versus other types of Les Pauls, but how would I summarize this for someone who's perhaps interested in both these guitars and thinking about the main differences and what they want? Well, I think if you're looking for something that's versatile, that's usable in lots of different scenarios, that's gonna help you get the best out of your playing, I think the Custom 24 is the option to go for. But I think for me personally, a Les Paul has this emotional, sentimental feeling when I'm playing it. But not only that, there are certain scenarios tonally where only a Les Paul will do. You can get close with something like a Custom 24, you can get close with something like a really great sounding Telecaster, but there are those scenarios, there are those songs, there are those situations in the studio where only a great Les Paul will do, tonally speaking. And in terms of feel, I have to say, when you come across a great Les Paul, they're one of those guitars like a Strat where they just feel right. And I guess that's a testament to these models and why they've been so successful and why they've been so widely adopted over decades, is that they're not really compromised in any way. They're ever imitated because they were such a great design. So there it is, that's my take on both of these guitars, both of the customs in my life at the moment. As I said at the beginning, I didn't want this to be any kind of like shootout or this is better or this is worse. I just wanted to highlight what I love about both of these guitars, what I use them for, and how they make me feel owning and playing them. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and until next time, I'll catch you later.